Sergeant Johnson had been counting down the days for months. Today was finally here, his son's high school graduation. After serving his country for 22 years, through 3 deployments and countless missions, nothing had ever made him more proud than watching his boy grow up to be a good young man. He woke up at 5 in the morning just like he had every day for the past 2 decades in the military. But today felt different. Today wasn't about duty or orders or serving his country overseas. Today was about being a dad. He looked at himself in the mirror as he carefully pressed his dress uniform. Every ribbon on his chest told a story. Stories of sacrifice, bravery, and service that most people would never fully understand. The drive to the school took 4 hours from the base where he was stationed. 4 long hours of thinking about all the moments he had missed while serving overseas. The soccer games he couldn't attend because he was deployed. The school plays where his seat sat empty. The birthday parties celebrated over scratchy video, calls from thousands of miles away. But he had never missed anything this important. Wild horses couldn't have kept him away from seeing his son walk across that stage. As he drove through the small town where his son lived with his mother, Sergeant Johnson felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Pride, certainly, but also some nervousness. Would his son be happy to see him there? They had grown apart during his last deployment, and teenage years are tough even when both parents are around. The boy had been angry about the constant moving, the new schools, the friends left behind every few years. Military life is hard on families, and Johnson knew his choices had affected his son in ways he was still trying to understand. He pulled into the school parking lot 30 minutes early. The graduation ceremony wasn't starting for another hour, but he wanted to make sure he didn't miss a single moment. As he sat in his car, he watched other families arriving. Parents with cameras and flowers, grandparents walking slowly but with huge smiles, younger siblings dressed up in their best clothes. Everyone looked excited and happy. This was supposed to be one of the best days in any parent's life. The school looked different than he remembered from his son's freshman year. They had added a new wing and painted the old brick building, but the main auditorium looked the same, the place where his son had performed in the school band just 2 years ago, before Johnson had to leave for his last overseas assignment. He remembered how proud he felt watching through a live stream on his computer from a military base thousands of miles away. It wasn't the same as being there, but at least he could see his boy playing his trumpet with skill and passion. Johnson checked his appearance one more time in the car mirror. His uniform was perfect, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his medals and ribbons properly aligned. He had learned long ago that how you present yourself matters, especially in situations where people might judge you before they even know who you are. In his 22 years of service, he had learned that respect sometimes has to be earned twice, once for your service and once for who you are underneath the uniform. Walking toward the school entrance, he felt the familiar weight of his dress uniform. It was heavier than his regular military clothing because of all the decorations he had earned over the years. Each medal represented a mission completed, a challenge overcome, or recognition for going above and beyond what was expected. But none of those achievements meant as much to him as being here today to celebrate his son's graduation. The weather was perfect, sunny, but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that made the flags outside the school flutter proudly. Other families were walking toward the entrance, chatting excitedly among themselves. He could hear bits of conversation about college plans, summer jobs, and how fast the kids had grown up. It reminded him of his own high school graduation many years ago when his own father had been there cheering him on. That day had been one of the proudest moments of his young life, and he wanted to give his son that same feeling. As he approached the main entrance of the school, Johnson felt a familiar flutter of nervous energy in his stomach. It wasn't the same kind of nervousness he felt before military operations. This was different. This was the nervousness of a father who wanted everything to be perfect for his child's big day. He had his invitation folded neatly in his uniform pocket, along with his military identification and driver's license. Everything was in order, just like he had been trained to prepare for every mission. The auditorium entrance was busy with families checking in and finding their seats. He could see teachers and school staff directing people and answering questions. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood, sharing in the excitement of the day. Some parents were already taking pictures, even though the ceremony hadn't started yet. He understood that feeling, wanting to capture every moment of such an important day. Johnson had imagined this moment many times during his deployments. Sitting in his bunk at night looking at pictures of his son, he would picture himself sitting in that auditorium watching his boy walk across the stage to receive his diploma. In those daydreams, everything was perfect. His son would see him in the audience and smile. After the ceremony, they would take pictures together and maybe go out for a nice dinner to celebrate. It would be one of those perfect father-son moments that would help make up for all the time they had spent apart. But as he got closer to the entrance, something felt different than he had imagined. He noticed 2 security guards standing near the main doors watching people as they entered. That seemed normal enough. Schools need security, especially during big events when lots of people are coming and going. But something about the way they were looking at people made him feel uneasy. It reminded him of the way guards at checkpoints overseas would study people, looking for anything that seemed out of place or suspicious. One of the guards was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression. The other was younger, probably in his 30s, with his arms crossed as he watched the crowd. They both wore uniforms and had radios clipped to their belts. Johnson had worked with security personnel throughout his military career, so he recognized the type. Usually, military security personnel were professional and respectful, especially when dealing with fellow service members. But these men had a different energy about them. As Johnson walked closer to the entrance, he noticed that most families were walking straight through without being stopped or questioned. Parents with their cameras and flowers, grandparents with their programs and tissues ready for happy tears, teenagers dressed up in their best clothes. Everyone seemed to be moving freely into the building. The guards would nod politely at most people, maybe say good morning or enjoy the ceremony, but they weren't stopping anyone or asking for identification. Johnson felt confident as he approached the entrance. He had his invitation, his identification, and most importantly, he had every right to be there. This was his son's graduation day, and he was a proud father in his military dress uniform. He had served his country honorably for over 2 decades, and he was looking forward to celebrating this milestone in his son's life. Nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen next. The first guard stepped forward as Johnson approached the doors. Instead of the polite nod or friendly greeting that other families had received, the guard's expression was serious and somewhat suspicious. The second guard also moved closer, and Johnson could feel their eyes studying him carefully. It was the same feeling he had experienced in certain situations during his military service. The feeling of being evaluated and judged before anyone even knew who he was or why he was there. Johnson had faced enemy soldiers, dangerous missions, and life-threatening situations during his military career. He had been trained to stay calm under pressure and to handle difficult situations with professionalism and dignity. But standing there at his son's school, wearing his dress uniform, and carrying his invitation to the graduation ceremony, he felt a different kind of tension building. This wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of his life as a father. The morning sun was getting warmer, and Johnson could feel sweat starting to form under his heavy dress uniform. Around him, other families continued to enter the building, easily, chatting and laughing as they found their seats for the ceremony. He could hear the school band warming up inside, the same band his son had played in just a few years earlier. The sound of the trumpets and drums reminded him of all the military ceremonies he had attended over the years, but this one was supposed to be different. This one was personal. As the guards stepped closer to him, Johnson straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever was coming next. His military training had taught him to face any situation with courage and dignity, but it had also taught him to recognize when something wasn't right. The way these guards were looking at him, the way they had singled him out from all the other families entering the building, it all felt wrong. But he was determined not to let anything ruin this day for his son. Whatever was about to happen, he would handle it with the same honor and professionalism that had guided him through 22 years of military service. The first guard cleared his throat loudly as Sergeant Johnson approached the entrance. His voice carried an edge that seemed out of place for what should have been a friendly school event. "Excuse me, sir," he said, though the word "sir" didn't sound respectful at all. It sounded more like a challenge than a greeting. Johnson stopped walking and looked at the guard with a polite expression. Years of military training had taught him how to read people in situations quickly. Something about this guard's body language told him this wasn't going to be a simple greeting. The man's shoulders were tense, his jaw was set tight, and his eyes were studying Johnson's uniform in a way that felt more like suspicion than admiration. "Good morning," Johnson replied calmly, keeping his voice steady and professional. Beautiful day for a graduation ceremony. He hoped that a friendly response might ease whatever tension was building in the air. Behind him, he could hear other families laughing and talking as they entered the school without any problems. The contrast was becoming more obvious by the minute. The second guard moved closer, positioning himself next to his partner. Now Johnson was facing both men, and they had effectively created a barrier between him and the entrance to the school. Other families were starting to notice what was happening, some slowing down to watch, others hurrying past with uncomfortable expressions on their faces. "We're going to need to see some identification," the first guard said, his voice getting louder. "And we'll need proof that you're supposed to be here today." He crossed his arms over his chest and stood with his feet planted wide like he was preparing for some kind of confrontation. Johnson felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. This was the same feeling he had experienced in certain situations during his military service. Moments when he realized that no matter how professional he tried to be, some people had already made up their minds about him before he even spoke. But he remained calm and reached into his uniform pocket. "Of course," he said politely, pulling out his invitation to the graduation ceremony. The paper was slightly wrinkled from being folded in his pocket, but the school's official logo was clearly visible at the top. His son's name was printed right, there in black and white, along with the date, time, and location of the ceremony. "Here's my invitation. My son is graduating today." The guard took the invitation and studied it like he was examining evidence at a crime scene. He held it up to the light, turned it over several times, and showed it to his partner. They whispered to each other while Johnson stood waiting patiently. Around them, more families continued to stream into the building without being stopped or questioned at all. Johnson watched as a group of grandparents walked past them carrying flowers and cameras. The guards nodded politely and wished them a good morning. A few minutes later, a couple with 2 small children hurried by, clearly running late for the ceremony. Again, the guards simply smiled and pointed them toward the entrance. Johnson couldn't help but notice that he was the only person being asked for identification and proof of belonging. "This invitation looks suspicious to us," the first guard announced loud enough for several nearby families to hear. "We don't think it's real." He handed the paper back to Johnson with a dismissive gesture, as if he was returning something worthless. Johnson felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression calm. "I can show you my identification as well," he offered, reaching for his wallet. "I'm Sergeant Johnson, United States Marine Corps. I've been serving our country for 22 years, and I'm here to watch my son graduate from high school." The mention of his military service seemed to make the guards even more hostile rather than more respectful. The second guard stepped forward and shook his head. "We don't care what you claim to be," he said loudly. "We think you're lying about being invited to this event." Johnson pulled out his military identification card and his driver's license, holding both documents out for the guards to see. His military ID clearly showed his rank, his years of service, and his photograph. His driver's license confirmed his identity and showed the same address that was listed on his son's school records. Everything was legitimate and properly documented, but the guards barely glanced at his identification before dismissing it. "These could be fake," the first guard declared, though anyone could see that the documents were official government identification. "We've seen fake military IDs before. People trying to get into places they don't belong by pretending to be something they're not." The accusation hit Johnson like a physical blow. In 22 years of military service, his integrity had never been questioned. He had earned every ribbon on his chest, every medal through dedication and sacrifice. He had served his country in dangerous places, missed countless family events, and made personal sacrifices that most people would never understand. And now, at his own son's graduation, his service was being dismissed as fake. "Gentlemen," Johnson said, his voice still controlled but with a note of firmness creeping in, "I understand you have a job to do, but I am here legitimately. That is my son graduating today, and I have every right to be here to support him." More families were gathering nearby now, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Some people were taking out their phones, though Johnson couldn't tell if they were preparing to record what was happening or just checking the time. The school band inside the building was still warming up, and he could hear the distant sound of students laughing and talking as they prepared for their big moment. The first guard looked around at the small crowd that was forming and seemed to get more aggressive rather than backing down. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave," he announced loudly. "This is a private event for family members only, and we don't believe you belong here." Johnson felt the world shift around him. He had faced enemy fire, dangerous missions, and life-threatening situations during his military career. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, being told he couldn't attend his own son's graduation ceremony. The injustice of it was overwhelming. "This is my son's graduation," he repeated, his voice still steady but with obvious emotion underneath. "I drove 4 hours to be here. I have an invitation, proper identification, and every legal right to attend this ceremony." The second guard pulled out his radio and made a show of speaking into it. "We might need backup here," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We have someone refusing to leave the premises." Johnson looked around at the faces of the other families who were watching this confrontation unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable, and a few appeared to be judging him negatively based on what they were witnessing. He realized that no matter how this situation ended, it was already ruining what should have been one of the proudest days of his life. The morning sun was getting hotter, and Johnson could feel sweat building under his heavy dress uniform. Weight of his medals and ribbons seemed heavier than usual, as if the symbols of his service were becoming burdens rather than honors. Around him, the normal sounds of a graduation day continued. Parents talking excitedly, car doors slamming. In the parking lot, the distant sound of the school's public address system being tested. "Look," Johnson said, trying one more time to reason with the guards, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to see my son graduate. I've missed too many important moments in his life because of my military service. Please don't make me miss this one too." But the guards remained unmoved. If anything, his emotional appeal seemed to make them more determined to remove him from the premises. The first guard stepped even closer, invading Johnson's personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "We've made our decision," the guard said firmly. "You need to leave now, or we'll have to call the police to escort you off school property." Johnson felt his military training kicking in, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly, even when emotions were running high. But he also felt something else building inside him, a deep anger at the unfairness of the situation, frustration at being judged and dismissed, and heartbreak at the thought of missing his son's graduation. Around them, more people were stopping to watch what was happening. Some were pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Others were whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was going on. A few parents were hurrying their children past the scene, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the air. The second guard was now speaking into his radio again, this time more quietly, but Johnson could catch bits of what he was saying. Words like "suspicious person" and "refuses to cooperate" drifted through the air. Each phrase felt like another blow to his dignity and reputation. Johnson looked toward the school entrance where other families were still walking in freely, preparing to celebrate their children's achievements. He thought about his son somewhere inside that building, probably getting ready to walk across the stage and receive his diploma. The boy had worked hard for this moment, maintaining good grades despite all the challenges of military family life, the constant moving, the long deployments, the stress of having a parent in dangerous situations. The thought of his son scanning the audience and not seeing his father there was almost unbearable. Johnson had promised himself and his son that he would be there for this important milestone. After missing so many other events due to military obligations, this was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be his chance to show up as a father, not as a soldier. But now, standing in front of two guards who seemed determined to keep him out, Johnson realized that all his military service, all his sacrifices for his country, all his efforts to be a good father despite the challenges of military life, none of it seemed to matter. In this moment, at his son's school, on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life, he was being treated like an unwelcome stranger rather than a proud parent and decorated veteran. Across the busy school lobby, 6 men in crisp Navy dress uniforms had been quietly watching the confrontation unfold. They had arrived 15 minutes earlier to attend the graduation of their teammate's younger brother, and they immediately recognized what was happening to the Marine sergeant at the entrance. These weren't ordinary military personnel. They were Navy SEALs, elite special operations forces who had served in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Each man had been through years of the toughest training the military could offer, and they had earned their place among the most respected warriors in the armed forces. But more importantly, they understood something that the security guards clearly didn't: the brotherhood that exists between all service members, regardless of which branch they served in. The leader of the group was a senior chief with over 15 years of special operations experience. His dress uniform was perfect, every ribbon and medal properly placed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He had served alongside Marines in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places that most people would never hear about. He knew what kind of man wore a Marine dress uniform with that many service ribbons, and he knew that man deserved respect, not harassment. "Something's not right over there," he said quietly to his teammates, nodding toward the entrance where Sergeant Johnson was still being confronted by the two guards. "That Marine's getting hassled for no good reason." The second SEAL, a younger man but still with multiple combat deployments under his belt, adjusted his white dress uniform and nodded grimly. "I can see his ribbons from here," he said. "That's a combat veteran being treated like garbage at his kid's graduation." The third member of their group was a petty officer who had worked closely with Marine units during his last deployment overseas. He had seen Marines like Johnson risk their lives to save his SEAL team members, and he had never forgotten that kind of brotherhood. "We can't just stand here and watch this happen," he said firmly. The fourth SEAL was the oldest of the group, a master chief with 20 years of service. He had gray hair at his temples and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of military life. He had attended his own children's graduations years earlier, and he knew how important this day was supposed to be for any parent. "That man served his country," he said quietly. "He deserves better than this." The fifth team member was built like a linebacker, with broad shoulders that filled out his dress uniform impressively. He had grown up in a military family and understood the sacrifices that service members and their families made. Missing birthdays, holidays, and important milestones was part of military life, which made events like graduations even more precious. "His son's probably inside right now wondering where his dad is," he observed. The sixth SEAL was the youngest of the group, but he had already served 3 combat tours and earned several commendations for bravery. He looked at his teammates and saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. "So what are we going to do about it?" he asked. Without needing to discuss it further, the senior chief made the decision for all of them. "We're going to go remind those guards what respect looks like," he said simply. "And we're going to make sure that Marine gets to see his son graduate." The 6 SEALs began moving toward the entrance in a formation that looked casual to outside observers but was actually carefully coordinated. They had worked together as a team for years, and they moved with the kind of quiet confidence that came from facing much more dangerous situations than a couple of overzealous security guards. As they walked across the lobby, other families began to notice them. 6 men in perfect Navy dress uniforms walking with purpose, their bearing unmistakably military. It was hard not to pay attention. Conversations around the lobby started to quiet, as people sensed that something significant was about to happen. Senior Chief reached the confrontation first, with his 5 teammates forming a loose semicircle around him. The security guards, who had been so aggressive with Sergeant Johnson just moments before, suddenly found themselves facing not 1 service member, but 7. The dynamic of the situation changed instantly. "Good morning, gentlemen," the Senior Chief said to the guards, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of leading men in combat situations. His tone was polite but firm, respectful but unmistakably serious. "It looks like there might be some confusion here." The first guard, who had been so confident when harassing Johnson, suddenly seemed much less sure of himself. He looked at the 6 SEALs surrounding him and swallowed nervously. This doesn't concern you," he stammered. "We're just doing our job." The second SEAL stepped forward, his own chest full of ribbons and decorations that told the story of his service in special operations. "Actually, it does concern us," he said clearly. "When we see a fellow service member being disrespected, it concerns all of us." Johnson looked at the 6 men who had suddenly appeared to support him, and he felt a wave of emotion that he hadn't expected. These men didn't know him personally, but they had recognized him as a brother in arms and had chosen to stand with him. It was the kind of military brotherhood that civilians often didn't understand, but it meant everything to those who served. The third SEAL, the one who had worked with Marines overseas, addressed the guards directly. "This Marine has served our country with honor," he said loudly enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear clearly. "He's earned the right to be here, and he deserves to be treated with the respect that any veteran should receive." By now, the lobby had grown much quieter. Families who had been chatting and laughing were now stopping their conversations to watch what was unfolding. Many of them were taking out their phones, some to record what was happening, others to take pictures of the impressive group of service members who had formed a protective circle around the Marine sergeant. The 4th SEAL, the Master Chief with 20 years of experience, looked directly at the security guards with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated much more dangerous enemies than 2 school security officers. "We've served alongside Marines like Sergeant Johnson in Iraq and Afghanistan," he said clearly. "Men like him are the reason all of us can sleep safely at night." The guards were now looking increasingly uncomfortable. What had started as harassing, one man they thought they could intimidate had turned into a confrontation with 7 decorated military personnel in front of dozens of witnesses. The first guard tried to maintain his authority, but his voice was noticeably less confident than it had been just minutes earlier. "Look, we don't want any trouble," the guard said, though he was the one who had created the trouble in the first place. "We're just following procedures." The 5th SEAL, the one built like a linebacker, crossed his arms over his broad chest and shook his head. "Procedures don't include harassing veterans at their children's graduations," he said firmly. "Procedures should include treating all parents with basic respect and dignity." Around them, the crowd was growing larger. Other veterans in the audience had noticed what was happening and were starting to move closer. A few retired military personnel in civilian clothes positioned themselves near the group, showing their support without saying a word. The balance of power in the lobby was shifting dramatically. The youngest SEAL spoke up, his voice carrying despite his age. "I've been to too many funerals for good Marines," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air. "Marines who died protecting the freedom that allows events like this graduation to happen peacefully. This man served with honor, and he deserves to be here for his son." The Senior Chief looked around at the crowd that had gathered, then back at the security guards. "Here's what's going to happen," he said with calm authority. "This Marine is going to go inside and watch his son graduate, just like every other proud parent here today. And if anyone has a problem with that, they'll have to explain it to all of us." The second guard tried one more time to assert his authority. "We still don't think his invitation is legitimate," he said weakly, but even he seemed to realize how ridiculous that sounded in front of so many witnesses. The Master Chief pulled out his own phone and held it up. "Would you like me to call the base commander and verify this Marine service record?" he asked pointedly. "Or maybe we should call the local news stations and let them know how veterans are being treated at this school?" By now, several other parents in the crowd had started speaking up in support of Johnson. A retired Army officer in civilian clothes stepped forward and introduced himself, offering to vouch for the Marine's character. A Navy veteran's wife approached with her husband and expressed outrage at how Johnson was being treated. The mood in the lobby was clearly turning against the security guards. The school principal, having been alerted to the commotion by her staff, finally arrived at the scene. She took one look at the situation. 7 military personnel in dress uniforms, a growing crowd of upset parents, and 2 security guards who looked like they wanted to disappear, and immediately understood that something had gone very wrong. "What exactly is happening here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before. The first guard started to explain their version of events, but she cut him off after just a few sentences. "The tar." Senior Chief stepped forward and calmly explained the situation to the principal. He spoke respectfully but clearly, outlining how a decorated Marine veteran had been harassed and prevented from attending his son's graduation, despite having proper identification and a legitimate invitation. The principal's face grew more serious with each detail she heard. She looked at Johnson's invitation, his military identification, and his driver's license, all of which were obviously legitimate. Then she looked at the 6 SEALs who had intervened, their uniforms impeccable and their bearing clearly that of elite military personnel. "I apologize profusely for this situation," she said to Johnson, her voice sincere and clearly embarrassed by what had happened. "This is absolutely not how we treat our military families, and it's not how anyone should be treated at such an important event." She turned to address the security guards with obvious displeasure. "You 2 will need to see me in my office immediately after the ceremony," she said firmly. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our school." The guards, now thoroughly defeated and embarrassed, stepped aside without another word. The confrontation that had seemed so intense just minutes earlier deflated as quickly as it had escalated. The power of brotherhood, respect, and standing up for what's right had prevailed over prejudice and abuse of authority. The principal personally escorted Sergeant Johnson toward the auditorium entrance, still apologizing for what had happened. "Please know that this behavior does not represent our school or our community," she said earnestly. "We have the highest respect for our military families, and what happened here today was completely wrong." Johnson nodded graciously, though he could still feel the emotional weight of what he had just experienced. The 6 SEALs walked alongside him, their presence ensuring that no one would dare to question his right to be there again. As they moved toward the entrance, other families in the lobby began to applaud spontaneously. The sound started with just a few people clapping, but it quickly spread throughout the entire lobby. "Thank you for your service," called out an elderly gentleman who was clearly a grandfather attending his grandchild's graduation. "And thank you all," he added, nodding to the SEALs, "for standing up for what's right." A middle-aged woman approached the group with tears in her eyes. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said to Johnson, "and I know how much your son means to you. I'm so sorry this happened, but I'm glad these brave men were here to help." The 6 SEALs had accomplished their mission, but they weren't ready to abandon their fellow service member just yet. "We'll sit near you," the senior chief told Johnson quietly, "just to make sure there are no more problems." Johnson felt a wave of gratitude that went beyond words. These men had turned what could have been the worst day of his life into something completely different. As they entered the auditorium, Johnson was struck by how normal everything looked inside. Families were finding their seats, students in Dior caps and gowns were lining up backstage, and the school band was playing cheerful music. It was exactly what a graduation ceremony should be, a celebration of achievement and family pride. The ugly confrontation outside felt like it had happened in a different world. The principal guided Johnson to an excellent seat in the 3rd row, right in the center where his son would be able to see him easily. "Again, I cannot apologize enough," she said. "Your son should be very proud to have a father who has served our country so honorably." The 6 SEALs took seats in the row directly behind Johnson, their white dress uniforms creating an impressive backdrop of military support. Other families in the nearby seats introduced themselves and expressed their gratitude for his service. What had started as a day of humiliation was transforming into something much more positive. As the ceremony began, Johnson felt his emotions settle into the excitement and pride he had originally expected to feel. The high school principal took the stage and welcomed everyone to the graduation ceremony. She spoke about the achievements of the graduating class, their bright futures, and the pride their families should feel in their accomplishments. When the graduates began filing onto the stage, Johnson scanned the group eagerly for his son. There he was, third row from the front, looking handsome and confident in his cap and gown. The boy had grown so much during Johnson's last deployment, and seeing him now, ready to graduate and move forward with his life, filled the proud father with overwhelming emotion. The ceremony proceeded through the usual speeches from the valedictorian, the salutatorian, and a guest speaker who talked about the importance of perseverance and following your dreams. Johnson barely heard most of it because he was so focused on watching his son and thinking about how proud he was of the young man he had become. When they began calling names for diploma presentation, Johnson's heart started beating faster. His son's name was coming up soon, and despite everything that had happened outside, this moment was going to be perfect. He pulled out his phone to record the moment, just like dozens of other proud parents around the auditorium. Robert Johnson, the principal announced clearly over the microphone. Johnson's son stood up from his seat and began walking across the stage with confidence and dignity. As he approached the principal to receive his diploma, he looked out into the audience and spotted his father in the third row. The smile that spread across the young man's face was worth every sacrifice Johnson had made during his military career. His son raised his hand in a small wave, and Johnson felt tears starting to form in his eyes. This was the moment he had dreamed about during those long nights overseas, and it was finally happening. But something even more incredible happened next. As Robert Johnson shook hands with the principal and received his diploma, the entire section where his father was sitting erupted in applause. Not just polite graduation applause, but genuine, enthusiastic cheering. The 6 SEALs behind Johnson were clapping loudly and calling out, "Hooah!" in military fashion. Other families in the nearby seats joined in the extended applause, clearly understanding that this was a special moment for a military family. The young graduate looked surprised but pleased by the attention, probably wondering why his diploma presentation was getting such an enthusiastic response from the audience. After receiving his diploma, Robert Johnson paused at the edge of the stage and looked directly at his father. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect and love that made Johnson's tears flow freely. 22 years of military service, countless deployments, missed birthdays and holidays. It all felt worth it in that single moment. Though, ceremony continued with the remaining students, but Johnson felt like he was floating. The confrontation outside already seemed like a distant memory compared to the joy of seeing his son graduate. The SEALs behind him patted his shoulders and offered quiet congratulations, sharing in his happiness as fellow warriors and parents. When the ceremony concluded and the graduates threw their caps in the air, Johnson stood and applauded with everyone else. The auditorium filled with the sounds of celebration, families calling out to their graduates, camera flashes going off everywhere, and the general chaos of a happy ending to years of hard work. Robert Johnson made his way through the crowd to find his father, still wearing his cap and gown and carrying his diploma. When he reached his dad, they embraced in the kind of hug that communicates everything without words. "I'm so proud of you, son," Johnson whispered in his ear. "You've become an incredible young man." "Dad, I'm proud of you too," his son replied. "I heard about what happened outside. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for making sure you were here." The 6 SEALs gathered around the father and son, introducing themselves to the young graduate and congratulating him on his achievement. Robert Johnson was clearly impressed by meeting real Navy SEALs, and they were gracious in sharing his moment of celebration. "Your father is a good Marine," the senior chief told the young man. "He served his country with honor and he raised a son he can be proud of. That's a pretty good legacy for any man." As families began filing out of the auditorium, many people stopped to talk with Johnson and thank him for his service. Word had spread about what had happened outside, and the community response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents introduced their children to him as a real American hero, and several veterans in attendance came over to share their own stories of service. The principal approached the group one more time before they left. "Sergeant Johnson, I want you to know that those security guards will not be working at our school anymore," she said firmly. "What happened today was completely unacceptable, and we're taking steps to make sure it never happens again." She turned to address the 6 SEALs as well. "And thank you, gentlemen, for showing our community what true character looks like. You turned an ugly situation into a lesson about standing up for what's right." Outside the auditorium, Johnson and his son posed for pictures together, joined by the SEALs who had become unexpected but welcome parts of their graduation day story. Other families asked to take pictures with the group, wanting to capture the moment they witnessed military brotherhood in action. As the afternoon wore on and families began heading home, Johnson finally had a quiet moment alone with his son. They sat on a bench outside the school, still in their formal clothes, watching as the parking lot slowly emptied of cars filled with celebrating families. "Dad," his son said thoughtfully, "what happened today with those guards? Does that happen to you a lot?" Johnson considered his answer carefully. He didn't want to burden his son with the harsh realities of prejudice and discrimination, but he also didn't want to lie to him. "Sometimes, son," he said honestly, "but what happened with those SEALs today, that happens a lot too. When good people see something wrong, they step up to make it right." His son nodded, understanding more than Johnson expected. "I want to be like them someday," he said, "like you and like those SEALs. I want to serve my country and stand up for people who need help." Johnson felt his heart swell with pride. Despite all the challenges of military life, despite the time they had spent apart, despite the ugly confrontation earlier that day, his son had learned the most important lessons about honor, service, and doing what's right. As they drove away from the school together, Johnson reflected on how the day had unfolded. It had started with anticipation and excitement, moved through humiliation and anger, and ended with pride, gratitude, and hope for the future. The 6 SEALs had reminded him that no matter what challenges he might face, he was never truly alone. The brotherhood of military service extended beyond branches, beyond ranks, and beyond individual circumstances. His son would remember this graduation day for the rest of his life, but not because of the confrontation with the guards. He would remember it as the day he learned what it really means to have courage, to stand up for others, and to be part of something bigger than yourself. He would remember it as the day 6 strangers became brothers, and the day his father's service was honored by those who understood its true value. Most importantly, he would remember it as the day he realized that being an American means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and especially when someone else needs your help.